good.
November 12th, I think.
Yeah. So before the break, we had gone through Jewish history and culture, and we had just started in on Roman culture. So we had talked about, Roman society, Roman government, Roman military, how all that worked. And now we're going to look more at Roman culture itself. How did the culture work? How did the family life work? Religion, all that sort of thing. Basically, how did the society of the early church work? How did the people who lived in the early church sort of understand their world? And as we mentioned before, under Roman rule, pretty much the entire Roman Empire had a more or less unified Hellenistic culture, sort of basically Greek with some Roman influence. Latin was the official language of the empire, and so any government operation was done in Latin. And Latin was really the everyday language of people who lived in the West. But people who lived in the East, which obviously would have included, places like Judea and Galilee and Samaria, and a lot of what we read about in the New Testament, there Greek was really the universal language. It was the language of trade, it was the language of education, and in a lot of places it was even the language of religion. Pretty much anyone who had any education was conversant in Greek. And really, even if you didn't have education, it was likely that you knew some Greek, in the same way that you go to a lot of countries nowadays and just about everyone knows some English. So it's very likely that Jesus and the disciples at least had some elementary Greek. And in fact, a lot of scholars are more and more thinking that at least some of Jesus' teaching was probably in Greek. I know we're usually told that Jesus spoke Aramaic. And that's probably true on a day-to-day level, but it seems likely that at least some of his teaching to the crowds would have been in Greek, because that would have been a more universal language, and possibly some of the debates he had with people like the Pharisees and the Sadducees could have been in Greek as well. Now, when we talk about Roman culture and the Roman Empire and what life was like there, you have to sort of get out of your head the picture a lot of us have of what it was like in, old times, where you think everybody was dirt poor and walking around muddy all the time and just living in little huts and that sort of thing. That picture actually really comes from medieval Europe after it had been decimated by the Black Death. Our sort of generic, this is what ancient world was like, is really sort of a post-Black Death Europe. And the Roman Empire, a lot of times things look very different. The Roman Empire was actually very urban-based and very cosmopolitan. Most people still lived in the countryside. The city, you were still in a minority if you lived in a city, but all the political power and all the culture was concentrated in the cities, and the cities could get very large. There are hundreds of cities throughout the empire, and most of them tried to at least some extent to reproduce Rome. They really tried to be sort of islands of Roman civilization. So a lot of these cities, even ones in Jewish areas, would be filled with temples dedicated to various Roman gods. There would be government buildings, public baths. Public baths were very, very popular. The Romans didn't like being dirty. There are archways and monuments, all those statues you see, Roman statues. You would have seen a lot of that. There were aqueducts, which were, you might have seen pictures of them, but they were basically means of getting water into the cities. There were amphitheaters like the Colosseum. The Colosseum's the best known, but you had amphitheaters like this throughout the Roman Empire. And virtually every major city would have had some place where you could have had, chariot racing, gladiatorial games, plays and dramas put on, and the like. Again, even in places like Judea, you would have seen these. And there were schools. Education, at least for the upper classes, was a big deal. And we'll talk about Roman education in a bit. But there are always schools where, classical Latin literature was taught. So cities really were the nerve center of the empire, and the Roman Empire was really built around these cities. And because of that, they were linked by and a very extensive network of roads. There are over 250,000 miles of roads in the Roman Empire, built by Roman armies and very well engineered to make it easy to travel between the cities of the empire. And this is really one of the reasons why the Bible talks about Jesus came in the fullness of time, is because it was pretty much the earliest time in history where travel was this easy, where the disciples and people like Paul would not have had a problem traveling throughout the Roman Empire and really spreading the gospel. And in addition to roads, there was also a lot of sea travel. So, taking a boat from one port to another was a very common thing. And by the 1st century BC, so in the era leading up to the birth of Christ, the Roman Navy had pretty much eliminated piracy. So the Mediterranean Sea was a very safe place to travel. There were storms and things, but it was highly unlikely that your ship was going to be stopped and raided and everyone on it killed by pirates. So the major shipping lanes in the Mediterranean were clear of danger. And travel on land was also much safer than it had ever been in the past. Again, because a lot of banditry had been eliminated by the Roman army. You still had some. There's a reason that Jesus, talked about the Good Samaritan and how the man is accosted by bandits on the way between Jericho and Jerusalem. And we talked about, before the break, how a lot of the Jewish zealots, a lot of the Jewish rebels would basically just become bandits in the hillsides that would come down and raid people as they traveled on the roads. But still, there was far less danger of being accosted by bandits on the roads than there ever had been before. And the Romans placed a really high value on the roads for a couple different reasons. For one thing, they knew trade was important. They knew for the empire to survive, there needed to be very healthy trade throughout the entire thing. So trade needed to be safe. And also, they wanted it to be easy for the Roman legions to be able to get anywhere in the empire relatively quickly. Rome also eliminated any kind of tolls within the empire. So there were no toll roads. There were no barriers to trade or to travel, which again made it very easy for someone like Paul to go from Judea to Syria, to Asia Minor, to Greece, and eventually even to Rome, and according to what we're told in some later Christian writings, even out to some place that we would, think of as like Spain. Again, this was all set up by the Roman Empire to make travel easy, to allow easy access to their armies, and to sort of hold the empire together. If you have something that big, you need easy travel to sort of hold it together. And, to the Romans, this was very pragmatic, but it also allowed very easy spread of the gospel. The historian Ivor Davidson says that travel and trade were more efficient in the Roman world than at any time prior to the 19th century. Then in the 19th century, you would get things like railroads, which obviously made travel much more easy. But you didn't see anything approaching that ease of travel between the Roman Empire and the 1800s. So again, you have to sort of get this, everyone living in mud huts and dirty and never leave their home picture out of your mind. That's not what the Roman Empire was like. Questions so far? So Rome itself, of course, was the largest city and the capital of the civilized world. At the time of Christ, it probably had a population of about 800,000 or so residents, which, compared to our big cities today is nothing. But back then, the world had never seen anything like that before. And there was a lot of infrastructure to support this. Probably the biggest engineering accomplishment of Rome was actually the Great Sewer, which ran through the houses of the rich and also serviced things like the public baths and public latrines as well. There were public bathrooms. So the Great Sewer actually serviced all of those. So you actually had things like running water and some amount of sanitation in Rome. And in fact, the Great Sewer is still in use. It's over 2,500 years old, and it's still being used today. There are also 11 aqueducts that brought fresh water into Rome from the nearby hills and actually provided about 50 gallons worth of water a day per resident. Now, the only people who actually got that water was the rich. You didn't have all this being, pumped into the poor areas. But if you were rich in Rome, you had, in a lot of ways, a very comfortable life with amenities that we would think of as very modern. So Rome was the biggest city, but by the time of Christ, there were a lot of other big cities as well, many of which you see mentioned in the New Testament. Probably after Rome, the biggest city was Alexandria, Egypt, which had about 350,000 to 400,000 people in it. Now, Alexandria isn't mentioned directly in the New Testament, but it did become a very early and very important center of Christianity. So Christianity grew very rapidly in Egypt and Alexandria, and it became very much a center of Christian thought. There was also Ephesus, as in, the epistle to the Ephesians. Ephesus is also where most early sources would say that the Apostle John ended up, which means that Mary, the mother of Jesus, probably also ended up there since Jesus charged John with taking care of her. Ephesus had a population of about half that of Alexandria, so about 200,000 people. And just as Alexandria was in a lot of ways the kind of intellectual center of the empire, Ephesus in a lot of ways was a religious center of the empire. One of the ancient wonders of the world, the Temple of Diana, was in Ephesus. And the worship of Diana, as in great as Diana of the Ephesians, if you remember when the people of Ephesus chanted that for hours trying to drown out the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts. So Ephesus was kind of a center of a lot of Greek worship, especially of the goddess Diana. There was a huge temple there to her, but there was a lot of other worship there too. So Ephesus was very much a religious center. Also Antioch, the first place that Christians were given the name Christians, which is in Syria, had a population of about 150,000. So it was another one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. It was the biggest city in the eastern part. We tend to think of Jerusalem as being a big deal. Jerusalem is a backwater compared to a lot of these places. Antioch was, in a lot of ways, the cultural center of the Mediterranean, of the eastern Mediterranean coast. And then you had other cities such as Corinth, as in the Corinthians, which had a population of about 100,000 to 120,000 people. So these are some of the big cities of the empire. And again, these were the places that Paul would travel to and preach the gospel. And then the gospel would spread from there. So the Roman Empire really was hundreds of these sort of Roman-esque cities spread all around the Mediterranean Sea, connected by this network of roads and waterways. And even though the minority of people were in cities, it was a very urban-centered culture. And this actually gave a lot of opportunities. You could be upwardly mobile in Roman society. And a lot of upwardly mobile people did very well. And if you did end up being very rich and very elite, you could really live a life of luxury, even what we as nowadays would see as a fairly comfortable life. The rich people would have very spacious, very well-built houses. Again, a lot of these places still exist. Usually you'd have sort of a house built around a courtyard with a garden. You would have a surrounding wall with bars on the windows for security. There were gardens, there were fountains. You would have indoor plumbing. You would have bathrooms. And there would usually be a lot of decorative artwork painted on the walls or in the form of mosaics on the floor, sometimes with obscene artwork, because the Romans were into that sort of thing. Some houses even seem to have had central heating. So you could live a very comfortable life if you were among the wealthy elite of Roman society. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to the poor. And as has been the case in virtually all societies throughout history, except for a few modern ones, there was a large division between rich and poor. And for the poor, if you lived in the city, obviously if you're out in the countryside and poor, you're probably a farmer, and their lives would have been quite different. But if you lived in the city, if you were poor, you would live in very cramped, unsanitary, dangerous conditions. And basically, Rome itself were filled with what were called insulae, which were what we would nowadays think of as sort of slum apartments. And they would be multi-story apartments with very tiny, cramped, unsanitary, dangerous living quarters. And poor people would just be packed into these. Most commoners lived in 5 or 6 story tenement houses. They would be made of concrete and brick with wooden floors. And not surprisingly, these buildings were fire traps, and fires were very common. Fires were incredibly common in Rome because, of course, any heating and cooking was done on small stoves or braziers with fires built in them. And it was very easy for the insulae to burn down and for those fires to spread. Probably the most famous fire was the Great Fire of Rome, happened in 64. That's what Nero used to sort of persecute the Christians. He blamed the fire on them. But that was just one of many, many fires that happened in Rome that almost always started in this very sort of low-rent housing. There were no sanitation systems in these buildings. You're told it was just a chamber pot that would be dumped into the street. Or sometimes you would dump them into vats which are on the staircase landings. And then hopefully someone come along and empty them. But unlike for the elite, which had running water and bathrooms and all that, it was a much less pleasant situation if you were poor. But for rich or poor, city life could be dangerous. Not surprisingly, there were no street lights, and there was no police force. At the most, you had, a local legion, stationed in your city that might help keep order. But for the most, there was no dedicated police force. So the cities could be very dangerous at night. If you were wealthy, and you had to travel at night, and even during the day, you would travel with an armed escort. You could afford to hire bodyguards, who a lot of times would be ex-military officers or soldiers, or even ex-gladiators. And if you were poor, of course, you just sort of you would either travel in a group, or you would just have to, risk it. And if you actually had to go someplace. And remember, the early Christians would have met at night because it would have been dangerous to meet out in the open during the day. So if you're an early Christian, this is what you were braving just to be able to go to a gathering of fellow Christians.
Aaron,
Mm-hmm.
so are you saying that they could move from poor to rich if they...
Yeah, most people didn't.
Okay, what kinds of jobs or how did they get money?
interesting enough, if you were actually a slave of the right kind of person and you were educated and could act as his manager and manage his business interests, you could gain money that way. You could even end up freed and, having a lot of money yourself. Gladiators could make a lot of money, even from, poor origins. So there were opportunities, but not many. I mean, it wasn't common for someone to be able to rise up, but it wasn't impossible. Anything else?
What about like their court systems? If they had no real police force, how was the order kept and who took somebody to court?
Well, you can even look at the Bible for examples of that. When Paul was arrested, he was arrested by soldiers. And usually it was because, people would be causing a disturbance that would get their attention. They would come and arrest him and imprison him. And then you would be tried by the local prelate or governor or whoever. And then what would happen would depend on whether or not you were a Roman citizen. I mean, if you weren't a Roman citizen, you'd usually be subjected to very harsh punishment. And a lot of times execution, including crucifixion. If you were a Roman citizen and you thought you were being tried unjustly, you could appeal to Caesar, which is what Paul did. And then you would actually be taken to Rome, and Caesar himself would hear your case. But yeah, basically, there was no dedicated police force. Law and order was pretty much kept by any soldiers that happened to be around. Anything else? So living in the city was dangerous. It was also rather uncertain. Whether you were rich or poor, obviously your food supply depended on the countryside. You weren't growing food in the cities, and you didn't have necessarily a lot of animals in the cities. So your food supply came from rural farmers. Now, during stable, peaceful times, as we've mentioned, travel in the Roman Empire was fairly easy, and there was a pretty reliable supply of food. But if there was famine, if there was war, if there was natural disaster, those supply lines could be disrupted very easily, and you would end up with massive starvation in the cities. Now, this was just sort of your general Hellenistic culture. Obviously, in many places, this overall Greco-Roman culture was resisted by more traditional people, especially in places like Judea, because the Jews saw Roman culture as very much invasive and as dangerous to proper Jewish culture and proper Jewish worship. So there was a lot of resistance. But again, there was a lot of acceptance too, and especially among the rich elite, people would tend to adopt Roman culture, like the Sadducees. The Sadducees were very Hellenistic, whereas the Pharisees very much opposed Roman culture. Now, the core of Roman culture, the same way as the core of our culture, is the family. And in a lot of ways, the family was more important to first century culture than it is today. Now, when I talk about family life, you have to remember that a lot of what we say about Greco-Roman and first century family life is somewhat uncertain. For one thing, we can be fairly certain that upper class and lower class family life work very differently. If your obligations to your relatives would have been seen differently for upper and lower class. Also, it's hard to know, based on the surviving writings, exactly how family life worked, because a lot of times the surviving writings are people putting forth their idea of ideal family life or what family life should be. And it's not necessarily how family life actually worked. We don't always know if what we're saying about first century family life would be the equivalent of some historian in the future watching episodes of I Love Lucy or Ozzie and Harriet, and then saying that 20th century husband and wives must have slept in separate beds. Because that's the information they're given, but it's not necessarily what was happening. So, we can't say everything of what I'm about to say is absolutely certain, but we do think we have some idea of how the family worked. We do know that someone's family was very much the starting point for their identity and status. This is something we talked about before the break, in that whether you're talking about Jewish culture, Greek culture, Roman culture, they were all collectivist cultures. You are seen less as an individual and much more as part of a group, and your core group was your family. Your family was your identity. Your family determined your status. And your family really shaped your own self-perception and others' perception of you. And you see this in the Bible. You also see this in other early Jewish writings. We read some from the Apocrypha before. But we can see this in the Bible, for example, in the emphasis that both Matthew and Luke place on Jesus' genealogy. It was very important that Jesus' family lineage be established, partly so that they could show that he was a descendant of David, but partly so they could just show that he was essentially a Jew in good standing, that he came from a known family. Genealogies were used to indicate very important information about the person, and it would be used to back up any claim that had the status, honor, or power. So it wasn't just, you don't get just genealogies in the Gospels. You get them in things like biographies of the various Caesars and other important historical figures, because, again, they were used to back up these claims to status. Note that you even see that in the two different genealogies of Jesus, because Matthew and Luke have different genealogies. They're the same until you get up to David, and then they split, and they follow two different family lines. And the reason for that, most scholars would say, is that Matthew is showing Jesus' place in the overall family of Abraham and his claim to Davidic descent. Whereas Luke even goes all the way back to Adam, showing the overall universal human nature of Jesus. And they're also showing, most scholars will say that one genealogy is showing Jesus' family line through Mary, the other is showing Jesus' family line through Joseph, showing that he is in fact descended from David on both sides. So these kind of genealogies were very important. And genealogies were done differently than we have nowadays. Some of you might have heard that genealogies back then could contain gaps. You didn't necessarily have every branch of the family tree shown. And you see that in the Bible. There are places where some people in the Bible are left out. Even in Jesus' genealogy, Luke arranges Jesus' genealogy in 3 groups of 14. But he does that by deliberately leaving some people out, so you get 14, 14, 14. And the reason he does that is because David in the Hebrew spelling is basically DWD. And if you add up the numerical values of those letters, that's 5, 4, and 5. So it gives you 14. So that's another way he was indicating Jesus' Davidic lineage. And this was very normal sort of usage for the time for genealogies. So genealogies were important because your family line was important. Your family line indicated your status. You got honor from your family. Any claim you had to power came from your family. And families were very close-knit groups, and your behavior toward family members was very different than toward non-family members. You wouldn't necessarily trust someone who was outside your family, but trust was usually automatically extended to members of your own family. And to treat a fellow family member as an outsider would have been seen as a very dishonorable thing, which is why it was such a big deal where if you take this morning's sermon, if you go and read ahead in Matthew 10, Jesus talks about how, sons will turn against their fathers and brothers will turn against brother and all that. And we don't realize the immense deal, the immense importance, the hardship that would have represented to his hearers at the time. The idea that the gospel would actually tear families apart. And Jesus' point is that it's worth it, that the family of God is more important than your earthly family. Outside of the family, the world was seen as very, very competitive. Non-family members were viewed with suspicion. Someone outside your family would have been seen as a rival or as an antagonist to your own pursuit of honor. And we talked about the importance of honor before the break. On the other hand, the family itself was supposed to be cooperative and mutually supportive. You were not really supposed to have competition within the family. Other members of your family should be working to increase their honor, but your honor as well. And ideally, older and more capable family members were not supposed to exploit younger family members. Everything was supposed to be very harmonious, very supportive, very cooperative within the family. Again, this is the ideal. We know, everyone knows that real families don't necessarily work this way, but this was seen as the ideal. We'll talk later about what was known as the patron-client relationship, which was a way of sort of extending this family cooperation outside the, technical family. But outside of that, you weren't really expected to trust someone outside your family. But if you met a relative, even if you'd never known them before, you would automatically extend trust to them. Family members were also expected to share common beliefs, common values. Think about all the times in Acts when, someone like Paul or the other apostles would say, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved and your house. Because it was expected that, especially if the paterfamilias, the male head of household was to become a Christian, it was expected the rest of the household would follow. Because members of a single family were expected to share religion along with other values. Again, harmony, concord, unity, these were the goals for a family. Notice how the New Testament extends this to the family of God, how we are supposed to dwell in unity, and how there is not supposed to be division or strife among us. This is Paul, when he writes these things, extending the Greco Roman idea of family out to the family of God at large, which in a lot of ways would have been a substitute for your own family who might very well have disowned you because you became a Christian, because you had left the family religion. Family members were ideally also supposed to hold everything in common. Again, much like the early church. Siblings were not supposed to allow money or inheritance to come between them. And family members were supposed to provide for any relatives who were in need. You were not supposed to allow a family member to remain destitute if you could help them. Again, very, very similar to what we see with the early church. Families were also expected to cover up the shame of other family members. And this is something that we tend to miss in something like the nativity story because we go into it with certain assumptions. But you might remember we talked about our inaccurate views of the story of the birth of Jesus before the break. how, we tend to think of Mary and Joseph as being very alone when they traveled to Bethlehem and when they were there, when in fact that almost certainly would not have been the case. They would have been part of a large family group, and that large family group would have seen Mary as being shamed for being pregnant out of wedlock, but as members of her family, they would not have abandoned her. They would not have let her be wandering the streets of Bethlehem looking for a place to stay. She would have been accepted into the home. And she almost certainly gave birth to Jesus in the home of Joseph's family, just in the lower story where the animals stayed. But families were expected to, help even members who had been shamed. And forgiveness was seen as very important among family members, again, in order to maintain that family unity. Now, when I say family, I'm not just talking about what we would see as the nuclear family. Really, your family was extended to the entire household. And the household would have been the father, the paterfamilias, the patriarch, basically the head of everyone. He was the master. He was the undisputed master. He had the power of life and death, even over his own wife and children. So he was the head of the household, the family. The family also included the wife. They included the children. It included the slaves, of which there could be few or many. Even some poor people might have held a single slave. So slaves were seen as part of the household. Not high-ranking parts, but parts. There are also extended family members potentially living in the same roof. Any guests while they were there were considered members of that household. Again, think about the passage in Matthew 10 that Tim talked about today, where, the apostles were told to go out and to stay in the households of worthy people in the town. And while they were there as guests, they should have been treated with the same level of courtesy as family. And Jesus basically said, if you aren't, leave and shake the dust of your feet out against them. So the people you took in as guests, the people you took in as employees or slaves were very important because you had to be able to trust them the same way that you would trust family. Now, marriage was treated a bit differently among the Jews and among the Greco Romans. For the Jews, marriage is what was called endogamous. That's endogamous, endogamous. Which meant that Jews tended to marry close relatives. As close as you could get, basically, and not violate the laws against incest in the Mosaic Law. So, no siblings, but cousins was the norm. And you see this in the Bible, you see it in stories in the Apocrypha. It was the norm to marry a cousin, maybe a distant cousin, maybe a closer cousin. At the very least, of course, you were expected to marry another Jew. Now, among the Hellenistic Jews, the Jews who had at least partially integrated into the wider Greco-Roman culture, this was somewhat weakened, especially since marriage outside of your, family and outside of Jews would have been seen as a way of integrating into that larger culture. And there were Jews who really wanted that because they wanted, to attain greater social prestige and, wealth and that sort of thing. And, Jewish marriage was preceded with a very lengthy betrothal that could only be broken by divorce. We've all heard that about Mary and Joseph. The reason why Mary and Joseph were engaged, but Joseph would have had to divorce her to break it was because that engagement in a lot of ways was seen as being binding as marriage. There were usually very lengthy and detailed marriage contracts. Marriage was not about love. It certainly wasn't about hormones. It was about joining two families, and because of that, everyone involved, and it was the two families involved, wanted to make sure that they came out with the good side of the deal. So there would be very lengthy marriage contracts determining things like the size of the dowry, what could one family expect to get from the other by giving them their daughter or son or the like. And the couple would usually live either in or near the groom's father's house. Now, Roman marriage was exogamous, exogamous, exogamous. And exogamous means outside the kinship group. Now, Romans usually did not marry close relatives. And usually Roman marriage was seen as a way of strategically aligning families. And this is especially true, among the upper classes where there was a lot of money and power involved. You would, marry in order to, gain that power and status of the family that you're joining your child to. Now, legally, all Roman women had to be under the guardianship of a male. And because of this, there are actually multiple forms of Roman marriage. One form of marriage is called marriage cum manu, C-U-M-M-A-N-U, cum manu. And that meant that the woman was under the authority of her husband. But there was also marriage sine manu, S-I-N-E-M-A-N-U, sine manu. And that meant that the woman actually remained under the ultimate authority of her father. And this would allow for easier divorce. Divorce was very big in Greco Roman culture, which is why Jesus came down so hard on it. Because the attitude to divorce was very casual in Greco Roman culture, very casual in Jewish culture, unfortunately. And a lot of times, because marriage was a way of raising your status or getting money, if something came along and you realized that marriage to this other woman would be more advantageous, it was very common to divorce that wife you had then and marry this other person. And Romans, especially Roman patricians, the aristocrats, would just go through wives like that. They would have multiples, not at the same time, because bigamy and polygamy was forbidden in Roman law, but they would just be sort of serial marriers. And if your wife remained under the ultimate authority of her father, that just made the divorce that much easier. Now, interestingly, in the eyes of the Roman government, only Roman citizens could actually be married. If you weren't a Roman citizen, they didn't really see your marriage as being official. Now, your local culture certainly would, but the Roman government didn't. And marriage existed to provide heirs and to provide inheritance. Interestingly, to the Romans, the purpose of marriage was not sex in itself. Sex was important to provide an heir, but a Roman husband was not usually expected to see his wife as sexually desirable or as someone he looked to for sexual fulfillment. Wives were there for heirs. Enjoyable, satisfying sex you got from mistresses, from prostitutes, or from young boys. In fact, it was actually seen by some as more honorable for the wives if their husband went to another woman for gratification, because to the Roman elite, it was not seen as seemly to be carried away by passion. So your aristocratic Roman wife would not want her husband to be carried away by passion for her. She would want him to use all his passion up on some other woman and then come to her for proper, producing of heirs and the like. The wives really were there for childbearing only.
But didn't they have heirs outside of marriage then?
Well, they wouldn't be heirs. They would be children. there were certainly illegitimate children outside of marriage, which usually were either aborted or abandoned at birth. That was very common in Rome. But the children, your heirs were the children born usually to your wife. Now again, divorce was very common. When a woman was divorced, she would return to her father's family along with her dowry so that she could be married off again. In Greco Roman culture, the wider culture, either the husband or wife could initiate divorce. For the Jews, only the husband could initiate divorce. So if you were a Jewish wife in an awful marriage, you were stuck. But at least in some circumstances, a Roman woman could divorce her husband. Now again, there was certainly a lot of potential for abuse in Roman families because the father, the paterfamilias, was the ultimate authority. He had the power of life and death over anyone in his household. And ideally, again, according to a lot of Roman writers who are putting forth the model of the ideal family, with this power would come responsibility, and the ideal Roman husband would take this responsibility very serious. The husband, the paterfamilias, was seen as the font of rational authority. Women weren't seen as rational. Children weren't seen as rational. Only the husband was the rational one, and therefore he was the only one who could reasonably exercise that level of authority because he could do it rationally, which was the Roman ideal. Now, again, ideally, this power was to at least some extent exercised in concert with the wife. The husband and wife were supposed to be partners, but not equal partners. The husband was still seen as the head. And again, you get an image of this in the New Testament as well, where it talks about, wives submit to your husbands, which would have been seen as the norm, but then husbands love your wives, which was very much not the norm. It was not expected that the husband would love his wife and love his children, but it was expected that the wife would submit to the husband. Now, marriage, women would oftentimes marry rather young, not, child brides, but like young teenagers. The husband a lot of times would be older, especially if she was not his first wife. A lot of times they could be quite elderly. But because of this, the wife a lot of times would come into the household with very little knowledge of how to run it. And it was the husband's responsibility to teach his new young wife how to manage the household. And then after that, once she learned, the household itself was more or less placed under her charge. The wife was the one who was supposed to manage the household, while the husband managed, outside relations, business and the like. And it was the wife's responsibility to be basically the executor of her husband's authority. He would give the orders. She would be in charge of making sure those orders were carried out. And in large households, again, for the wealthy elite, this could result in the wife, even though technically still being under her husband's authority, still having a good deal of power of her own. She could even exercise considerable authority outside the household if, the management of the household called for that. Nonetheless, at least for certain Romans, and it's kind of tough to tell how universal this was, but at least to some extent, the woman was supposed to be silent around any outsiders, any non-family members, and she was only supposed to speak to and through her husband. In fact, to emphasize this subordinate nature of women, daughters' names in Roman society were usually just the feminine form of her father's name. You had, instead of Julius, you had Julia. Instead of Cornelius, Cornelia. Instead of Claudius, Claudia, and the like. And a lot of times, all the daughters would have the same name.
How did that work? Just imagine.
You would have nicknames or the like, but, daughters were pretty disposable. They were there to be married off in exchange for money or status or power or the like. So they were seen as just extensions of her husband's, status. Or not husband's, extensions of her father's status. And
did they have to marry by age? Like, did the older daughter have to marry before the other?
Not as far as I know. I mean, most likely something like that would probably happen because, again, you didn't marry for love. So it would be most likely that unless there was some reason not to, the father would marry his oldest daughter off first, and then the others as they came of age, which happened around 14. A daughter was seen as more or less an adult by the age of 14, and usually by that age you would have a marriage arranged by the father. Unlike in Jewish society, Roman marriage did not require a legal contract. In fact, there didn't even have to be a formal arrangement. You could have a lot of Roman marriages were basically just what we would think of as common law. You would just, especially if you were more of a poor family and couldn't really, afford all the formalities, and there wasn't like a lot of money to be at stake. The marriage would just be, she would just move in with her husband, and there wouldn't really be much more beyond that. And marriage wasn't necessarily seen as a religious or a sacred thing. Unlike with the Jews, where marriage was very much before God, for the Romans, it was much more pragmatic, much more just a legal relationship. Other questions?
I have a question. There's a lot of Indian people, even to this day, that still, the parents
arrange the marriage, yeah.
So is that where some of that comes from?
Well, it's more that virtually all ancient societies work that way. The idea of marrying for love, the idea of not having your wedding arranged, really originates in about the Western culture in about the 1700s, and there weren't many instances you see of it before that. So it was pretty universal among ancient cultures. And a lot of modern day cultures, Indian, Arab cultures, and the Chinese culture in a lot of ways, still maintain it. Now, it's weakening in almost all of them, largely due to Western influence. You have, Indian people and Chinese people and Arab people marrying more out of their own choice, out of love now. But it's still seen as perfectly normal to have an arranged marriage. And it works. In a lot of ways, it's better than what we have. You go into it with eyes wide open. You know you don't love your spouse at the start. You expect to have to work on it. And you're expecting to come to love them in time. And a lot of times those marriages are very healthy. But yeah.
We just had a friend that they got married and it was their arranged wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to really be all about how much money.
Oh yeah, very much so.
And then it was really interesting because he didn't even know her until
that's not uncommon either.
Yeah, so and it's like us, we're like, I can't imagine my dad picking up somebody for me when I was young,
You want to hear something really odd? Back in the 90s, when I was my teens and early 20s, you had the whole purity culture thing, and you had a lot of Christian speakers and writers advocating not just for courtship, but some were actually advocating for more or less arranged marriages to protect kids from, because they believed that dating was evil, that you weren't supposed to date. So there are some who are actually saying the best thing to do is just to have your parents arrange your marriage. I don't know how many Christian teens actually did that, but there were definitely people who were advocating for it.
I think it also comes from kind kind of a key distinction between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy is that Western philosophy highly respects the sovereign individual.
Yeah, it's very individualistic.
Yeah, it's very, very individualistic. And in traditional Eastern philosophy, you're not an individual human. You're a part of a family, or you're a cog in a machine, or
Yeah.
you're a part of the culture.
And marriage is all about the families. It's your duty to your family it's the duty of the head of the family to arrange a good marriage. And good doesn't necessarily mean someone that you're happy with, compatible with. Good means marriage that will benefit the wider family unit to the best degree. It's his responsibility to arrange a good marriage. It's your responsibility to go through with it. And it's unquestioned. I mean, it's just what you do.
Well, I even have a friend that's Asian, and they still, and I always wonder where it came from, but she's a big family, and it's like she can ask me a question, and I will give her advice. But if her sister or her brother or her son tells her anything different, it's like, oh no, I'm definitely wrong. So now I'm back to the point where if she asks me, I just go, no.
Yeah, and we talked about that some before the break. I keep wanting to say last semester for being a professor. But we talked about that, how, in collectivist cultures, which is basically every culture outside of modern Western culture, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago too, is that you are expected to share the beliefs of your family. And you're expected to consult older, wiser members of your family before you change your beliefs or before you make a big decision, because what you believe isn't just you, it affects your whole family. And going against the rest of your family can very much lead to ostracism and shame and family strife, which is what they're absolutely wanting to avoid.
Well, I think this makes it clear to me when I see other cultures and they don't act like we do, and you're like, I don't understand that. It's like, and then now you're talking about this, and it's like, so I guess a lot of say the Asian or the Indians, they probably have carried on a lot more traditions in that area than we have.
Again, and you see that in almost every modern Western culture is kind of unique in the history of the world in that we are trying actively to disconnect ourselves from almost any ancient traditions. In pretty much every other culture, they highly value tradition.
How old would a man be when he gets married?
He could be in his late teens up to being an old guy.
When they have their first wife.
That would depend. I mean, you would usually marry probably in your 20s, because you would be expected to be established enough to provide for a wife. So the wives were usually younger than their husbands. Not like me and Mama. Okay, so this is a good stopping point. Next time we'll continue to look at just how sexist Greek and Roman society was.